Welcome, everyone, to Cor Ecclesiae. Now, this is a monthly podcast that's coming directly to you from Sacred Heart University. But what is this podcast? Well, it's from the heart of the church. It's a roundtable-style podcast series that is hosted by Sacred Heart University. Now, I've done variations of this in the past, but this is a more concentrated and framed and monthly planned event. It's designed to explore the evolving landscape of the Roman Catholic Church under the leadership of the current pontiff, Leo XIV. But it's not limited to that. It'll go beyond it. Each episode will provide both scholarly insight with historical perspective, reflecting on the Church's enduring traditions while engaging with the pressing questions of today's larger Catholic world. We have four panelists. Well, we have three in addition to me, and we will have guests over the course of the year. They will help us to bridge the gap between academic scholarship and public understanding of a tradition that is rich and engaging, perduring, and sometimes fraught. Well, who are the panelists that are going to be part not just of an occasional appearance, but constitutive of the program itself? Well, Michelle Loris, she's director of the Center for Catholic Studies. She's an associate dean in the College of Arts and Sciences at Sacred Heart University, and she's the author of other things, of Innocence, Loss, and Recovery in the Art of Joan Gideon. Charlie Gillespie is associate professor of Catholic Studies, also at Sacred Heart University, and he's the co-director of the Pioneer Journey, and he's the author of the forthcoming God on Broadway, Revealing the Sacred in the Spectacle, and this is due this coming November. Dan Rober is Associate Professor of Catholic Studies at Sacred Heart. He's a regular contributor to Commonweal magazine in New York, and he's the author of Recognizing the Gift Toward a Renewed Theology of Nature and Grace. My name is Michael W. Higgins. I'm Professor Emeritus at Sacred Heart, and I'm the author most recently of The Jesuit Disruptor. My new book, A Synod Diary, The 60 Days That Shook the Church, is coming out in January, 2 months after Gillespie's book appears in November. So it's part of the aftershocks. Our topic today, and for this first session, is Pope Leo XIV and his first 100 days. Now, we all know that those first 100 days have been calculated differently by different media. Is it the first 100 days that follows that moment when the dean of the College of Cardinals asked the candidate, did he accept the responsibility as the Supreme Pontiff, or does it in fact begin with the inaugural Mass that started his papacy formally in St. Peter's Basilica? Well, it doesn't really matter enormously because it falls within the proper range or ambit. So here we are within the 100 days, if not exceeding them a mite. And on the feast, as Charlie and Dan have reminded me, of Saint Monica, Augustine's mother. And of course, Leo is an Augustinian. Well, these first 100 days reveal the tone and style and priorities, but what are they? He's the first American Pope, and he's the second Latin American Pope, as he reminds us. Okay, let's go around by taking, first of all, a reaction to tone, style, and priorities of Robert Prevost, the first American Pope. Okay, we'll start with you, Michelle.
So tone, style, and priorities. I think it's pretty clear he is an extremely thoughtful person. He is intentionally reflective. He's somewhat restrained. He's cautious. I think he's probably, methodological in his thinking. So I don't think we're going to hear something fired out quickly from him. I think he will think about it carefully. But he is also someone who is definitely a bridge builder, and he wants dialogue. He wants encounter. He wants people to be synodal, if you will, and the church. In terms of his priorities, I think definitely, he has spoken about peace and against, war and violence in these 100 days so many times. And, really, I want to say, starting with his peace be with you. But, you know, clearly, he's given us the day of fasting on the day of the Queenship of Mary. And most recently, he is going to publish for World Peace Day, which isn't until January 1st, but he is already putting that together. He's spoken about the crisis in Gaza. He's spoken to Zelensky. He's spoken to Netanyahu. He's not only asked us for a day of prayer and fasting, but on the Feast of the Assumption, he spoke against violence and said the way you choose your life. So clearly that is a priority, I think, something that he's brought the papacy to the global stage in doing that. But I want to say, even though I agree with you, he's not an easy read. I think this is from his heart. I think that this man is so broken from his heart. He feels about war and violence and wants to be a moral voice for peace. I don't think I really think that. I mean, clearly, he's going to bring forward Vatican II, and he's talked about that, bringing forth synodality. Um, and he's even celebrated now the Mass for our common home, right? He's done that,
Yeah,
the
creation.
Laudato Si.
Yeah.
So I
Okay,
think that
let's go to Charlie here. I saw you nodding agreeably, Charlie, when Michelle was talking about peace. What's your reaction to the first 100 days?
Yeah, I think Michelle actually laid out a vision for how to interpret Pope Leo's first 100 days that is exactly spot on. Emphases on peace, listening, and being present together. We know that he wants to bring the church together as his first task, and he's done so through a kind of public performance that is the now macro version of his reserved and listening personality. If you think about any accounts of him at the Synod on synodality, he was someone who listened carefully, chose his words carefully, and always showed that he was engaged in the active synodal work of listening. And I think we've seen that in his pontificate in the first 100 days, emphasizing clarity around the church's teaching about peace, having that be a touchstone of what his teaching office is going to be, but demonstrating that it is through unity, through our ability to come together across our differences, that we can create space for God to help us achieve peace in the world. So I think Michelle is spot on, and I hope later in our conversation today, we can talk a little bit about how he also seems to be calling us to think about peace not just in conflict zones, but also in our everyday lives, by seeing things like a Mass for the Care of Creation to be an invitation to recognize the ways we're also in need of being at peace with ourselves and our local world.
How does this differ, before we get to Dan on this point, how does this differ, though, Charlie, from Paul VI? I mean, he was the peace pope. I mean, it was John the 23rd that did Pacem in Terris. Why should we think that Leo is different in this? Where's the nuance?
I think that's a great point. On the first hand, I think what we're seeing from Pope Leo is that arc of continuity in the 20th century pontificates, which is to say that one of the roles of the Holy Roman Pontiff for the whole world is to be a voice of peace between warring nations and between civilizational conflicts. Where there does seem to be a slight difference and nuance for Pope Leo is this emphasis that there is a call for the individual Christian to be a peacemaker, a listener, and a connector at the local as well as the macro level. So what I see from Pope Leo is not just a call from Pope St. Paul VI talking to the United Nations and helping the nations of the world develop a peace dialogue and get better treaties. I hear a call from Pope Leo that we're also called to make peace in our local context. We cannot think about peace on our common home unless we're also making a peace with our neighbors that we're living with and in our church institutions.
and in
One
our
way,
individual selves,
yes,
Charlie. I'm sorry
Yeah,
to
yeah.
interrupt,
yeah.
but Michael, 1 minute.
No,
In
no,
our
we
individual
need to get to
selves.
Dan. No, we need to, Michelle, let's get to Dan here, get his reaction. Dan?
Sure. So I'd like to build on some of what's been said already. I'd like to shift the emphasis a bit from the ad extra to the ad intra for a second. Because I think the peace point is something that we're going to see Leo try to pursue within the church, and I frankly think will be appropriate. And this, the connection to Paul VI that Charlie made and that you made is a good one. If you look at the sort of patterns of pontificates recently, and again, this goes with the old Roman saying of, a fat pope follows a thin pope, right? That you get a disruptor pope followed by a stabilizer pope. That's been the pattern certainly since Vatican II, right? John the 23rd is somebody who's shaking things up, disrupting things. He is succeeded by Paul VI, who is a stabilizer, right? Who is somebody who tries to navigate the church through challenging waters. John Paul II, right? He was pope for a long time, but was a disruptive personality to the papacy in terms of being this sort of globe-trotting world historical figure, right? Who brought something different to the papacy than Paul did, who did some of the same things, but was a much different personality. Certainly did not view himself in the same way in that role. So Benedict XVI then comes in with a kind of stabilizing, quieter personality. Right. Now, again, stabilizing can easily be seen as a kind of conservative move, as both Benedict and Paul were interpreted in various ways, accurately or not. You could debate the particulars of that. But I think Pope Francis had an appropriately disruptive papacy, right? He was, in a sense, given a mandate to shake the institution up, because in 2013, the institution was in crisis. And so Francis came in and shook things up and freewheeled and did things in a different way, and opened up a lot of important pathways of reform, as did John at Vatican II. So I think where Leo is situated now is to try to stabilize and carry forward that reform project, right? There were a lot of people leading up to the conclave who were hoping for a pope that would just kind of bury Francis's reform project and pretend all this had never happened. That's certainly not what is going on with Pope Leo. But I think a lot of Pope Leo's job is to be somebody who brings unity both to those who were enthusiastic for Pope Francis, but also trying to bring those who may have been less enthusiastic along into the future together with everyone else, right? To avoid schism, to move things forward. So I think he very much is projecting as a Pope of peace in those areas, even as he is somebody who has, certainly done nothing to move backwards, I would say, on anything that Francis did. And in fact, some of the appointments that were made at the end of Francis' pontificate, and that he was head of the Congregation for Bishops for, have certainly moved that agenda forward. We've seen this in Detroit, for example, with the dismissal of several anti-Francis faculty members from the seminary by Archbishop Weisenberger. So again, I think there is a ministry of peace from within the church too, to bring people together insofar as is possible.
Yeah, I wrote an article recently in the Globe and Mail on the 100 Days, and I talked about the Augustinian consolidator following the Jesuit disruptor. And it's going to be very difficult to know how to map this papacy so early in the days, right? But one of the things I did note, and I'd like your reaction to this, that is a dissimilarity, if you like, between Francis and Leo, and I suspect will become even more so, is that Francis took on clericalism often by berating the clergy. He would give annual Christmas addresses to the curia, and he would deplore their paralysis, their pharisaical approach, their inability to make changes. Similarly, when he was talking to seminary rectors, and I can tell you, I know, I was in Rome at the time, how he would denounce ecclesiastical flippery, the love of raiment by younger clerics, and all this kind of thing. Well, if Francis berated the clergy, it seems to me, judging from fairly recent things with Leo, Leo befriends them. He's gone out of his way to affirm young clerics in formation. They love him, as we saw recently in an instance in Rome when he gathered with them. When he was prior general of the Augustinians, he actually went out, and I think Chris Wright writes about this in his book, went out and met young religious in other religious houses to encourage them in their vocation. Now, so there's a sharp difference here because clericalism still is a significant problem in the structural and sacramental life of the church. Is the approach of Leo going to work in a way that, to some degree, did with Francis?
If I could pick that up just because it's playing off what I was saying, I've said many times that I think one of Leo's most important jobs vis-a-vis the United States, particularly in the odd intra, the odd extra is a whole different set of issues.
Sure.
But the odd intra in the church is the conversion of the younger clergy. That to me, the path out of clericalism is not abolitionism as such, right? I mean, there are people, Gary Wills in his later years took a turn in that direction, but certainly there needs to be reform of who can be part of the Catholic clergy. But even if such a reform were instantiated tomorrow, it would be several years before you would see the fruit of that coming
Of
about.
course, yeah.
And that would still be a significant minority of those serving would be coming from those, from newer constituencies. So there is a real need to bring along those who are there for the sake of the people of God, for the good of everyone. That, trying to open people's hearts insofar as they can. Because again, conversion is an ongoing, lifelong process. And one would hope with good faith that those who have chosen to dedicate their lives to the church would be open to the continuing grace of conversion in their hearts. So again, I think a lot of it again is sort of a personality distinction, right? And again, something that was going to have to be shifted in the sense that in any institutional culture, if you have bosses who berate the employees for too long, that becomes kind of demoralizing, right? You need to balance the criticism and affirmation in order to have a positive culture and in order to avoid, again, just demoralizing, embittering, etc.
That the employees, right? I want to go to a point that Michelle made earlier, which I think is very significant, and that is in the nature of how he thinks. You were talking about him being quite methodical, and we know that he's the first canon lawyer, actually, since for a century. Pius X was, to some degree, a canon lawyer, initiated, of course, the Code of Canon Law that Benedict XV formalized in 1917. But we really haven't had a canon lawyer as Peter for over a century. Canon lawyers think differently than theologians. Okay, so they're more forensic, they're more, as Michelle says, more methodical. So what can you expect from a canon lawyer that is going to be different from the theologians that we had with Paul, with Benedict, the historian that we had with John the 23rd? Will his experience as a pastor in a missionary country mitigate some of the natural tendencies to be conservative, risk-averse, reserved in church life? Michelle, can you respond to that? And then we'll go to Charlie and Dan.
Okay. So that he is methodical or careful in his thinking, I don't necessarily think it has to be conservative. I mean, we have to wait and see where he will go. But as I said before, I think it's going to be slow going with him. And to the point that Dan made in terms of speaking to the seminarians, et cetera, it will be, he's trying to create, formation for these young men. So he's praising, that they're celibate, if you will, and trying to affirm them. And I think that's how he's going to approach everything. I mean, he has some big things that will be coming up for him. He still has to think about, women in the church. He still has to think about gender and sexuality. Those are issues that Francis left on the table. But I think his approach is going to be, again, that very thoughtful, intellectual, careful, thinking it through. But he also has that sort of that Augustinian spirit, that spirituality, if you will, about him,
Yeah.
and he's thinking in some ways, we were reading The City of God this summer. And as I looked at some of the things Leo was saying, it reminded me of Augustine. How are you a Christian person in this secular world? And the approach is going to be step by step. So I don't think he's going to come out with any, but he will have to address these very big issues of sexuality, gender, of women in the church, the LGBTQ. He did make a few appointments. He appointed a bishop, I think, who was favorable to LGBTQ issues. The document, Fiducio Supplicans, that's been
Yeah.
affirmed still.
Well, that speaks to your earlier point about him being a bridge builder, right? He's irenic. Peace is key to this, but peace can also be paralyzing. I mean, it can work both ways. Charlie, you were nodding agreeably when Michelle was talking, particularly about the Augustinian interiority dimension. Do you want to follow up
Yeah.
on? Yeah.
I think this is actually extraordinarily important. Michelle gave us two words that are key words for understanding what Pope Leo has done in his first 100 days. The first is formation. So when we look at the problem of clericalism for the church, there is a tendency to think that clericalism is a problem for the princes of the church and the clergy, when in fact, clericalism is a disease of the whole body of Christ, because it does not respond to the gift of God's clergy serving the whole people of God as a sacramental sign of grace. And that clericalism instead forms the people, whether it's the bishop or the lay people, to think about the priest as somehow set apart from the pilgrim people of God. We are all on a pilgrimage home to be with God. And so one of the responses I think Pope Leo is making around the scourge of clericalism is, if Pope Francis gave us the anathema sit, that it is a problem that the church has been formed to think clerically in this way, it is now incumbent on everyone to do Augustinian formation of the desire of our seminarians, to have them see and long to be Christ in the world, serving those most in need and offering the sacrifice of the Holy Mass for the whole church. The other angle of Augustinian spirituality that Michelle's brought up for us is that same idea applied to the code of canon law. I think most of us, if we're not professional canon lawyers, have a sensibility that even though we might not be turned away from Roman Catholicism because of its rules and regulations, we're all well aware that one of the things the church has had for centuries is a clear account of what the rules are. And that can lead to a kind of regularism, if you will, a sense that the law is the one that serves God, as opposed to we, as the pilgrim people of God, have canon law as a way to remain in unity. And there's also a formation of a sensibility that the purpose of the law is to keep us together on our journey and not to become an obstacle to our relationship with God. And so I think that sense of inner formation that Michelle is pointing towards is essential for how we might think about canon law. And I have great hopes that this canon lawyer Pope will also invite us to think about how canon law might need to read the signs and the times and recognize, in the words of Gaudium et Spes, what the church needs to be the church in the modern world.
That's a very illuminating and hopeful expression, I think. A little Pollyannish, I think, when it comes to canon law. I think with rare exceptions like Ladislas Orsi, and there are a few others, canon lawyers, by and large, are lawyers. So their approach is forensic, it's risk averse, it's reserved, and I'm thinking in the context of how bishops have been trained themselves, right? There was a time right after the council when many of the brightest young men in the church were sent to do theological graduate work to the great universities of Europe. Then increasingly, after John Paul II, increasingly the best minds didn't go to these universities, and we know there was a general hemorrhaging of many of the best minds from the seminaries anyway. But what happened was a huge concentration in canon law. Many rectors, future episcopabally, whatnot, they've all come from a canon law tradition. And so we're now top heavy with canon law. It's almost Kafkaesque. We're top heavy with canon lawyers. We need theologians. We need historical and systematic theologians. What I like about what you say, Charlie, is it gives us an aperture of hope that because he is in fact a canon lawyer with direct pastoral experience in missionary territories, he may be in the position to regenerate that gift of the church when we have several younger minds studying the more, quotation marks, organic and serious traditions of theology, church history. It is Maggio Fagioli's great concern, right? Is we can't find anybody who knows anything about church histories. So how do we go forward if we don't know our past? But anyway, Dan, it's time for you to step in here.
Sure. So I'd like to add a couple of distinctions to the canon law discussion, because I think, and this is where I think Leo's background, both as a religious and as an American with large swaths of experience outside of the American and Anglophone world, are very important. Because I think a lot of the sort of right-wing turn in the sort of canon law world has happened in American circles. And I think with a lot of American canon lawyers who have internalized American legal structures, Anglo-American law, and have not properly internalized the actual logic of canon law, which is Roman law, which operates according to a whole different set of structures and tends toward ideals, right? As does moral theology, right? And in the same way that many of the same people, and again, this does go back to the John Paul II era, so you're correct to point out the connection here, much in the same way that many of the same people have interpreted morality in a kind of rigid way as opposed to a way gravitating toward ideals, right? The same thing has happened with canon law. Because I think actually canon lawyers, there is that sort of, highly conservative turn that can happen, but there is also a highly pastoral turn that can happen, because if you're engaging in canon law and you're dealing with the kind of cases you have to deal with and everything, it puts you up close and personal with the sort of human side of how church teaching and church law get applied. And everything that I see about Leo is that he is somebody who has been transformed by that, who has internalized that human side of things. And again, I also think his work in Latin America, right, a place that is not governed by Anglo-American law, is also very helpful in terms of this point. So again, I think canon law training has to be read in context, and nothing about Leo's personality, ministry tends in the direction of the most problematic kind of places we've seen canon law go in the last 30, 40 years.
That's interesting. I want to do some. Yeah, Michelle, you want to say something?
Well, I just one little bit. In talking about that he wanted to, continue with Vatican II, he said we have to give attention to the Sensum Fidei. Also, as an Augustinian, there was a document published about the importance of the laity. So, I mean, these are things that I think they're small, but I think they point to the fact that he is not, because he's a careful thinker or maybe a methodical thinker, doesn't necessarily mean he's a rigid thinker.
No, that's right.
Or nor conservative. I think,
No. I think that's a very good point, that you can be methodical and deliberative without being necessarily rigid. I think that's quite right. It's the perception of canon law. You made some very good distinctions about that, Dan. But I think the mind of a lawyer is very different from the mind of a visionary. And with Francis, we had a visionary. Visionaries can be disruptive, of course, and then you need to have the corrective. And Dan provided that by looking at the recent series of papacies, how one papacy is corrected by the next one. But I want to read you something right now. It's a little provocative. It's not me speaking, it's somebody else, but I want your reaction to this because it's already generated considerable reverberations in various parts of the Catholic world. It's by a lawyer, by a canon lawyer, but also by a civil lawyer who's a judge and a professor in the Faculty of Canon Law, Faculty of Civil Law, and the former president of Ireland. I'm talking about Mary McAleese. Now, McAleese is a bit of a gadfly. She's a fiery personality and whatnot, but here's what she said last week in the Tablet of London on the first 100 days that has generated a great deal of commentary. And I want your reaction. Again, this is Mary speaking. Francis's synod on synodality, so promising at the local level across the Catholic world, has failed abysmally at the centralized magisterial level, where heavy editing, redacting, and rerouting of contentious matters, such as the role of women and teaching on same-sex relationships, only deepen the skepticism of many Catholics that change might indeed be possible. Pope Leo finds himself standing beside Sisyphus at the bottom of the hill. Whether he will be able to overcome Sisyphean hubris and push the stone to the top is not yet clear. There are, however, worrying signs that he might not even want to bother trying. Okay, now this is a bit of an indictment. It's very strong, but it's by someone who knows the church, who's studied canon law, who is herself a jurist, who is a public advocate, particularly for LGBTQ issues in Ireland and on the continent, and has been a strong advocate for women for years, right? So her view can't be discounted. Now, it's fiery, it's indeed incendiary, that's what Mary's like, but she's a member of the church, and this is her assessment. Is it negative, do you think, too negative? One friend of mine from Australia wrote and called it dystopian. He couldn't believe that he was reading this. So it's a little check on the optimism many of us have about the pontificate, but maybe it's over the top. What do you think? What do you think? I'll start with you, Dan.
I think I don't particularly share the hermeneutic here. I actually think the whole Sisyphean idea of the Pope as the individual pushing the stone up the hill is exactly what Francis was trying to get us away from, and what I think Leo even more is trying to get us away from. That if you really want to have a synodal church, if you really want to implement all these things, you have to decenter. It can't be about the lone man in charge pushing the hill up. It has to be about us. It has to be about the institution, the people in the institution, not about one institutional leader doing that. I just don't think, and that's a problematic. It's a problematic ecclesiology. Again, it's to me, it's internalizing the kind of hierarchy that McAleese wants to disrupt by making it into this lone thing. It's about pulling everyone together. And I also think, again, the literal weight of the metaphor is kind of deadening, right? To me, it sort of internalizes despair. I was thinking of another woman with complicated relationship to the church, Corita Kent.
Oh yes,
the artist, and one of her rules for students and teachers, number 9, enjoy yourself. It's lighter than you think. And I think there's a danger. And again, I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish. I don't want to say you should avoid these problems. But I think there's a danger in like drawing a bill of indictment and handing it to somebody who is trying to imagine his way through this role. And again, I think in a different way than Francis did, but a pronounced way, try to get away from the kind of overwhelming weight of the role,
right.
to then make it into this Sisyphean thing. So
Yeah,
that's my take.
That's very good. I want to come back to that in a minute, but I want to go to hear what Charlie and Michelle say. Charlie.
So I love that Dan's opening this up for us, because I think I am going to be Pollyanna-ish a little bit and say there's always something about a prophetic indictment that has a fire to it that is supposed to spark conversation. And I think that the reason those comments about the early days of Pope Leo are so important is because it is very easy for us to dodge how loudly so many members of the church wanted the synodal process to center questions of women's participation in the life of the church, both at the level of ordination, whether to the sacerdotal priesthood or diaconate, or even what it means to have lay leadership, which de facto includes women laity and women religious, as well as questions of the LGBTQIA plus community. These things, for so many Catholics around the world, were central issues that were never brought to the center of the synod. Now, the reason I think I'm being a little Pollyanna-ish here is I do think Pope Leo has surfaced that while those concerns need to receive the prophetic ire of people like Mary McAleese to keep them on the radar and in our conversation, they are not the sum total of what the church is listening and journeying together can be. And if one's hope is in the church changing on those particular issues that are the top tier for some regions of the world, but are not for this global Catholic church, then that is a misplaced hope. And if the Sisyphus image is about what it means for the Church Catholic of 1.4 billion people in every culture on the planet to change the direction of the ship overnight, that is also imposing a sense of speed that the civil law might need to respond to, but a church founded by Christ that is going to continue beyond even the civilizational worlds we're used to will endure. That's going to take time, and there might be a habituation to patience. The last word, however, so I don't sound too Pollyanna-ish, is patience is always, around questions of justice, a threat.
Very good. If you keep this up, you'll end up being a Peritus at the Vatican Council III.
No,
Michelle, do you have your reaction?
Well, I brought that up in some of my opening comments, that the issues that Leo still will need to address will be these hot button issues of gender, sexuality, women in the church, the LGBT. So I had already brought that up, but I disagree with the indictment because it's only the first 100 days. And I think what we're seeing is his desire, as we've already pointed out, to bring some unity to the church, to bring a focus on Jesus Christ as the bridge to bring humanity to God. Everything he talks about focuses on that. He spoke to the young people about the restlessness in their heart. He spoke to the people when he spoke in Chicago about the restlessness in their heart. He's speaking to all of us, to everyone in the church, trying to bring them first together to what should be the focus, which of the city of God, right? Which is Christ leading us on our journey, on our pilgrimage. And so he does that by inviting the homeless for a lunch outside of Castle Gandolfo. He's appointed a woman to, I'm forgetting where in one of the dicasteries, but
yes, as the bishop's dicastery. He's also confirmed the appointment of a woman as the head of the governorate. So the governor of the Vatican City State.
So
but they are nuns.
He makes
consecrated
these
religious
small movements showing both his pastoral side, his leadership, his spirituality, all of these pieces. And he's only been the Pope for 100 plus or minus days. I don't know what the date is. So I just think it's too early to indict him. I think it's okay to say, Leo, over the next time period, and as Charlie pointed out, patience, and justice are correlated. I think it's okay to say that that's what he needs to look at, but I don't think we know yet.
Well, that's going to be one of the things this panel does, right? We're in our minor way going to be there to remind Leo, like a letter to Leo, here are the things that we need to talk about. And that's one of the reasons why in an upcoming session, we'll be looking at that poll that you did with Great Blue, in which you gathered all this data. And I know that Dan's done some commentary on this, but I want to go back to a point that Dan made, which I think is essential. And that is this. We and all of us are prone to this, particularly in the media, but in the academy as well, to attach far too much importance to the role of Peter. The Pope then becomes a victim of the culture of celebrity. And we saw that reach a maximum level with John Paul II, who went out of his way actually to cultivate it. Benedict pushed back against that culture of celebrity. Francis brought it back in inadvertently. It was not part of his pastoral strategy, but he became an instant international success. People had expectations. They responded to his charisma. I think there's something very much accurate and profound in Dan's assessment of Mary's indictment, in that Mary attaches so much importance to hierarchical power and authority, rather than recognizing a more inclusive ecclesiology in this. Do we expect too much of our popes? Number one. And number two, why do we transform them into celebrities, which is always an inherent danger, and in many ways a unique American phenomenon? America has a tendency to celebritize more than any other nation I know. And because he's also the first American pope, is this going to be a dangerous pit he could fall into? Do you think he's conscious of that, trying to avoid the celebritization of the office and of his role, particularly since the priorities of the Apostolic Palace are not the same priorities of the Oval Office? So how does he negotiate this? This brings us into a political ecclesial era, I know, arena. But I mean, every pope is involved in that to some degree. They don't topple regimes like Wojtyła contributed to with the end of the Soviet Empire in 1989. But they are nonetheless, and Charlie was talking about this earlier on, they're major players on the international scene. How is he going to negotiate this? Dan, you've spent a lot of time writing in Commonweal and elsewhere about the political and theological interface, particularly in the American context. How do you think Leo's going to manage this?
Sure. Well, to your point about celebrity, I mean, I think one of the real positives around Leo is that kind of everything in his personality and formation resists celebritization. Right. He is somebody who has been formed and whose personality goes against, and in a constructive way, right? There have been lots of celebrities who have hated being a celebrity, right? And that's been destructive for them. Think of somebody like Kurt Cobain, right? Where like, yeah, his personality resisted celebrity in a self-destructive way. I don't think that's the case with Leo, right? I think he's a balanced person, right? Who was not looking for this, who, right, is not looking to be a kind of, international symbol any more than just kind of being the Pope inherently makes you. As far as, managing the political dimension of things as an American, I think that personality trait and his kind of attention to these things, and again, his being plugged into English language media and all this kind of stuff, is helpful in the sense that he is somebody who is not going to take the bait and get into a flame war with somebody like Donald Trump, right? Who wants people to get into flame wars with him, right? That's how he operates.
It's his modus operandi.
Yeah. So, like, Leo is not somebody who is going to take the bait and start a war of words with someone like that. Now, that can be a plus or a minus in the sense of going back to your point about Francis and prophetic leadership, right? Right. He's got a great opportunity. You alluded to our poll, and one of the results from that poll, and by the time this airs, I think the press release about that will be out, is that people really view Leo as an American figure. This is Americans, and do so positively. So he's got an enormous bully pulpit in a sense. And I think it is incumbent on him to use that carefully and for the good. But I think thus far, his holding on to capital in that area has probably been wise in terms of settling into his role. I think going forward, there could be a danger, as we've seen historically with somebody like Pius XII, of sitting on that moral capital rather than using it. And if I were advising Leo, I would tell him that. But I think the jury is out yet on how he will use his kind of moral currency.
Charlie, following up on some of the things Dan was saying here, and given that you're an expert on celebrity with Hollywood and Broadway and spectacle and theology, how do you view this?
So I think Dan's exactly right in the fact that Pope Leo is accruing his political capital and he's waiting for the right moment to deploy it. But if we think about the spectacle of the pontificate, what we're noticing with Pope Leo is a way of signaling that it is possible to be private in one's religious conversation, conversion, and practice without making it secret or outside of the public realm. What I mean about that is that Pope Leo's discussions about peace and the relationships he's going to build with world leaders are not going to be flashy statements that tells an elected official in any country around the world, or a monarch or a prince or a despot, precisely what to do, but instead will be form a relationship with that person and teach what the church knows is the truth of this instance. For example, all of his discussions of peace with all of the different conflicts around the world right now is based in forming relationships and trusting one another so that deep conflict can be resolved without resorting to warfare. I think that is a part of his performance of the pontificate. If you want a second one of how we look at the fact that his receding from public life is actually a signal of what he thinks the church is teaching in the modern world, is look at the fact that this pope was elected and in his first 100 days takes 2 days extra vacation. What does that mean for how we think about how we serve in the world? It's also to make space for others. It's very easy for the Pope to take up all the air in the room because he is the head of the church and Peter. Look at what Pope Leo has done in his performance of the pontificate. If we're going to listen, it's not just around the synod table, but it's in everything that we do. And maybe that also means listening to our common home of creation by slowing down a little bit and taking time to rest and recreate. So I think there's something there about the image of the Pope that's going to help all of us reflect on what is the way to respond to the world in which we find ourselves.
How is that different, though, in a way, Charlie? It's its style from Francis's Fratelli Tutti and the work he did with regard to dialogue, right? The importance of dialogue, recognizing the other. He came in for a heavy criticism from the former governor of Hong Kong, Lord Christopher Patten, and many others as well, over his inability to realize what was going on in conversations between Beijing and Rome. Similarly, he was criticized for trying to make efforts to dialogue with Putin, right? And he was running into headwinds from Patriarch Kirill, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church there. And of course, we know he was so irritated the authorities in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem that they pulled their ambassador to the Holy See at one point out of conversation with him. So how is Leo different than Francis in that regard? Because in many ways, Francis set the template. And that template actually had been set as well by previous popes. It's a matter of refinement and polish, of course, as you know. But I mean, how is what you say about Leo both continuous with and a departure from Francis, do you think?
Yeah, briefly, I would say it's mostly continuity. What we've heard from Pope Leo is in all of his public statements, by centering questions of geopolitical peace as a marker of his pontificate, has been to be in deep continuity with all of Pope Francis's teaching about the necessity of dialogue. I also think he's risking the same criticisms of being too patient with evil regimes and I'll leave that open, around allowing their activity in order to form relationship first. I think there is a straight line of critique that could say a concordat with the Chinese Communist Party was a bad idea. We might see some of the same critiques of Pope Leo. I think one slight difference is a constant signaling that the church is not going to be quiet about atrocity. And so while that is something that Pope Francis was loud and clear about in his public performance, what we're seeing with Leo is a clear teaching and a quieter response to the specifics. Now, that might not be the right strategy. It might be conciliatory and perfect for making an organization work together, and that might not be the right strategy for global conflict. I think Dan reminding us of Pope Pius XII was a wise way to respond to some of the threats of the world right now, of at what point has the church waited to speak too long? That, I think you're right, Michael, is something we need to be looking at with Pope Leo, and to hold the pontificate accountable. When is it time to speak out clearly and directly?
Michelle, do you want to weigh in on this?
Well, just a bit. I mean, I agree with both what Dan has said. You know, Leo is not the kind of person who's going to take a Trump bait, for example. He's not going to do that. But interestingly enough, and probably some of this had to do with Cardinal Cupich's planning, but he did speak at that Chicago White Sox game, and he did speak to everyone about their restless heart and finding peace, etc. But he did it on Donald Trump's birthday, and he did it when Donald Trump was bringing a parade of the armed forces. So I think that that's just interesting. All right, I'm not going to even, you know, speculate that it was intentional, but I'm going to say it's interesting. I think he's been a very clear moral voice. Now, whether he hasn't acted in ways that would, but he's invited peace talks to be at the Vatican. He's spoken to Zelensky, spoken to Netanyahu. He's, he said, starving people is a cheap way to wage war. That's kind of a, strong statement in some ways. So his moral clarity and his moral voice is there. I don't think that and he has signaled that. Now, as Charlie pointed out, do we want more? Do we expect more? Should there be more action? I still think it's only 100 days. So, whether I'm being Pollyanna or I'm just being cautious and patient, I don't know. But
and again, that's our job, right? It's our job as a panel to watch this, monitor it, and see which ways it goes. You know that one of the great challenges that faces the papacy as an international political institution is, of course, it tries to avoid taking any kind of position, particularly. It becomes obsessive, indeed, about its neutrality. The problem is, as has been raised by several, including many senior ecclesiastics, is that often there isn't a moral equivalence. The situation between Kiev and Moscow is not morally equivalent. And one could make as compelling an argument, the same is true of Jerusalem and Gaza. There's no moral equivalence here. So Francis was more direct, if you like, and Leo is more indirect, and in that way, perhaps more diplomatic. But it does raise some interesting points about how, that leadership as the head of the Vatican City State, thereby making Francis also a political Leo also a political figure, in sharp contrast to his spiritual role, which I think all of you are emphasizing is so important to Leo, that Leo's spirituality informs what he does, in ways that the Jesuit Pope was slightly different in his strategic outpouring and his leadership style. I want to end, because we're running to the end right here, with a comment that Charlie surfaced earlier on in an email to me about Leo modeling a way of being, and you've raised it already at one point, by taking some leisure time, by going to Castel Gandolfo, by not working 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Francis was a driving force, okay? We all know that. He didn't go to Castel Gandolfo, which really irritated the local merchants because their economy plummeted. So There, will Leo be a kind of intermediary or take on a more moderate position between Benedict going there for an extended period of time, meeting with the Schülerkreis and all those admirers and writing books and whatnot, and Francis never leaving the Apostolic Palace except for international trips or pastoral visits, and certainly never taking a holiday? Do we need a pope that's going to remind us of the contemplative importance of leisure? What do you think? And we'll conclude on that. Dan, go to you first. Do you need some leisure time?
I think this is positive. Again, I think modeling a healthy work-life balance from the papacy is a positive thing. I mean, I think another element of this is the fact that this is, Pope Leo is the youngest man to be pope since the early 1990s.
That's right.
So, right, we had two straight older popes. So in different ways, right, Benedict was an older man who I think felt the need for more leisure time. Pope Leo is a bit younger, right? And again, Francis, as you say, was just somebody who just would not stop working. So, yeah, I think he is modeling something constructive for us in terms of work-life balance, and something that we can all look to as we think about our own lives in a culture that pushes us to work too hard.
That's right, Charlie. You were talking about it in terms of the corporate grind. Is this an antidote to the corporate grind?
I think it is. I know I need a nap, and I'm sure everybody else does. And one way that we can think about that time of Castel Gandolfo is to see that the Pope's going to inaugurate a new ecological and educational village in the Borgo Laudato Si next month. And I think what we saw in Pope Leo reminding us that actually, if we're going to care for our common home, if we're going to live together and have this home be a place we want to live, we also need to remember to delight and enjoy God's creation and our company. That Augustinian sensibility that it's not just to use the world, but also to delight in it, I think is an important message for us today, because the only response to the burnout our culture is pushing all of us to, whether that's burning out for the climate or burning out for ourselves in our day-to-day life, is to recognize that rest and restoration is precisely what God said was so important. That's how God spent the seventh day of creation.
Good point. Michelle, you're one of the hardest working people I know. Are you taking Francis Leo as a model?
I actually, I did think about it when he took those days, and it's not only restoration, but it's that retreat into, if you will, that leisure time, that work-life balance is the way that one replenishes one's soul.
Yes.
And I don't know how much time he spent playing tennis or praying, right? In other words, that's an opportunity, a time really to deepen his own reflection, his own spirituality, his own relationship with God through his time in nature, in leisure. And, as somebody who doesn't always stop, I know that we need that. I know
Well,
that
we do have to stop right now, but you're absolutely right about that. Rejuvenation is a full human sensorium thing. It's got to be emotional, spiritual, and intellectual, as well as physical. So you're right. And we're going to give ourselves some rejuvenation time because we're wrapping up our first session. Our next one will be next month. These will be monthly, and they'll be timely, and we'll be looking at some of the results of the poll that was done with Sacred Heart University and Great Blue, keeping an eye, monitoring very carefully the moves and the initiatives and the statements of Pope Leo as well, and we'll be inviting guests to join us periodically during the course of the year. Thank you for watching, and see you again.